I'm sure that Rachel and Leah were both wonderful women, but you don't want to confuse them, right? Remember that story of Jacob? And he works for all those years for Laban and he thinks he's marrying Rachel and he wakes up with Leah, right? Okay, well, sometimes you don't want to confuse things that are good, right? Even blessings of the Lord. In this video, I want to talk about what happens if you confuse justification and sanctification. Now, obviously, those are both wonderful, wonderful gifts of the Lord, but they are quite different. And what happens if we confuse them in our lives is actually we get some perturbations of the soul. Sometimes we're disturbed about our spiritual life. Sometimes we don't understand where we're at or what our standing is with the Lord. And so in this video, I'm going to give you two super easy charts, and we're going to look at the difference between justification on one hand and sanctification on the other. Both beautiful, wonderful gifts of grace of the Lord, but again, you don't want to confuse them. Before we get into that, real quick, I just want to mention that Gospel Fellowship PCA is having a fall conference this year. The fall conference, the Theology conference, is going to be on the topic of civil governments, and it's right the week of the election. So it's going to be off the chain. I don't know what's going to happen in the election, neither do you. But I will tell you this, on November 8th and 9th, we are going to have a really great, totally free conference, a theology conference here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. I'm going to put a link in the description of this video where you can register for that conference, totally free. We just need to know that you're coming. And if you do register, please actually come. That would be really helpful for us. All right, so great speakers, great lineup, professors, theologians, pastors, all talking about civil government. We might even disagree with each other a little bit about what the best way to carry on as a Christian in the midst of this kind of a society actually is. All right, well, let's put that aside for right now, and let me give an explainer of the difference between justification and sanctification. Okay, now in this chart here, and I really want you to memorize this, like get this deep into your mind and into your heart. Justification is one of the greatest gifts that we have in Christ. That's why Paul loves the concept of justification. He's always talking about it in Romans, in Galatians. He loves it. Now, justification is a forensic concept in which we are saved from death. Check this out. Here's death over here, right? Whoops. Let's go back to this. Here's death. And you're dwelling in death. Your life down here is just the squiggly line of chaos and turmoil and guilt and shame and regret. You are in the midst of death while you are unsaved. And then when the Lord regenerates you by grace through faith, boom, you are born again. Watch this. Boom, immediately you pop into the realm of life. But not just life in the fullest. When you are justified, you have the full righteousness of Jesus Christ imputed to you. Okay, so you have the righteousness of Christ. He takes your sin guilt, your sin debt in his death on the cross. That is imputed to him. Your guilt imputed to Christ, and his righteousness is imputed to you. Now, notice this green line up here. It is static, it is constant, it is sure, it is unwavering, much unlike your life before Christ, where it was quivering down here in death mode. When you are justified, your righteousness is absolutely secure and it is unwavering, and it's the righteousness of Christ, not just your guilt taken away, as though you were brought to that line right here at zero, like no sin, no guilt, no shame anymore, but actually you have the status and the righteousness of Christ. If I could make that green line higher, I would, but for the sake of this chart, understand that for the rest of your life, your justification is going to be completely and totally constant. Now, let's look at that chart that I accidentally showed you earlier. Here is sanctification, quite different than that. Once again, before Christ, you are wallowing in sin and guilt and shame and death. Some good days, some bad days, but mostly you're just a wretched sinner, right? And then boom, you pop into life by grace through faith. You're regenerated, you're born again, right? Through the power of Christ. And sanctification, though, notice this line is squiggly. It's kind of like when you were a dead sinner, except that you're in the realm of life and that you are slowly making progress in righteousness. Now, look at this. You got a terrible day right here, maybe even a terrible year, maybe a bad decade, for all I know. But the stream here, the trajectory is growth and faithfulness in Christ. You're certainly going to be stronger, more mature, and more faithful in Christ at the end of your life than you were at the beginning. Now, I'm not suggesting here that anybody makes it to sinless perfection by the time they die. Please don't get that impression from this chart. That's not my point. You don't get closer and closer to perfection as you approach your death. However, there certainly should be a trajectory of maturity and growth and Christ-likeness, and that's what we call progressive sanctification. Okay, so when we compare these two charts to each other, you're going to find that there's quite a big variance. Like here you are today, you're right here, right? Well, your justification is in a completely different stratosphere than your actual experience down here as a believer. And yet, both of these are true for you at the same time. These are not in contradiction to one another. They're not at variance with one another. These are both descriptions of your status in Christ. As to your justification, you have the righteousness of Christ. It's unfailing, it's unflagging, it's constant, it's secure, it's sure. And yet, your sanctification does sometimes bounce up and down as you're following Christ, maybe falling into some disobedience, maybe falling back into some besetting sin that you have in your life. But nevertheless, the point of this chart is that your sanctification is, in fact, moving upwards as you go through life. Christ is working in your heart, and you are growing in maturity as a true believer, okay? So there's always going to be this gap of this experiential gap, let's call it, between your justification and your sanctification, and yet nevertheless, they're both headed towards the same place, which at death, you are going to be glorified. That's what the theological term is. Glorification is being made ready and fitted for heaven. Now, let's compare these two things, because what happens is a lot of kind of chaos in your heart if you confuse these two. So we don't want to confuse these two. Justification is instantaneous. The moment you are born again, the moment you are saved, your justification is secure. It's forensic, meaning this is courtroom language. This is a legal status between you and God. God has officially rendered you, he has officially declared you to have the righteous status of Jesus Christ in the courts of his heavenly place. This comes to us by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, and it is objective, meaning that it's the same on your good days as it is on your bad days. Now, let's look at sanctification here, because we do have some differences, okay? Both of these are gifts from the Lord. They're both beautiful, wonderful things that happen to us as Christians, but they're different. Rather than being instantaneous like justification, sanctification is progressive. Now, to split a hair, sometimes the Bible does speak of a kind of sanctification that is more of a categorical sanctification. But for this purposes of this video, we're talking about that progressive growth type of sanctification here. Instead of being forensic, it is experiential, which is why sometimes you do experience the ups and the downs of Christian faithfulness, and conversely, sometimes unfaithfulness, as you may be in a state of rebellion at any given time, in any given moment, okay? And rather, as far as your experience of growing in sanctification, we do need the means of grace here. And by that, I'm talking about Bible study, prayer, worship on the Lord's Day, the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. These things are what nourish the soul and help to edify us along the path of that progressive sanctification. So notice that both of these are by grace. Actually, neither of these is by works or by your own effort and striving. Rather, they are gifts of God by grace, but sanctification leans into the means of grace, those things that we use and employ and utilize, even the hardships, even sometimes our failures in confession draw us into further and further strength. And of course, it's going to be subjective rather than objective. You and I, we both have objectively the same justification in Christ, but subjectively, we may be in two totally different places in our faith journey. And of course, that's going to be true for all of us, okay? So don't get these confused. You don't want to confuse justification and sanctification, because if you do, then on your really wretched days, you may feel like you've lost your salvation. Of course, that's not true. It's impossible to lose your salvation, but that's why some people feel like they've lost their salvation, and that's why some people actually believe that you can lose your salvation, because they've confused the gift of justification and sanctification. All right, well, I hope that was helpful little explainer for you. Don't forget, we'd love to see you at our Fall Theological Conference at Gospel Fellowship PCA. Please come check that out. You need to register, link in the description. It is totally free, but we'd like to know you're coming. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.